Wonderful. So before we get started, at any point in the webinar, if you have a question for myself or our guest speaker, please do try to put it in the Q&A section of this webinar and not the chats, just so we can keep them organized and keep track of them. So again, you can do this at any time during the webinar. Just submit your question there. And then at the end of the webinar, we will go through all of your questions and make sure we get them answered as thoroughly as possible. So once again, thank you so much for being here. I'm Dr. Jessica Roberts and the Director of Habitat Connectivity, and we are really excited to go through this monarch tagging with Monarch Watch. And this relates to our work we do here at Wild Virginia quite a bit because we work with protecting habitat corridors, especially for connectivity purposes, but really to emphasize protecting our biodiversity, like our monarch butterflies, which actually our eastern migratory population, which our guest speaker is going to go over a little bit today, has seen quite a decline from the 90s, a decline of about 80%, which is quite a lot. And they are listed as a species of greatest conservation need in Virginia. So they're sort of protected, and we are making efforts to improve their habitat. So a lot of this in Virginia is coming from the construction of roads and other development, agricultural expansion, climate change, and the loss of one of their very essential plant species, which is milkweed. So here at Wild Virginia, we are trying to protect these habitats, and those especially called ecological cores, which have a lot of our native plants and their ecological integrity, so we can better protect those monarchs. But we also want to do other things like tagging them and creating what's called way stations, which our lovely speaker is going to go over. It's something that you can do to help protect these monarch populations and get them from decreasing populations to increasing populations. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker and hand it over to her. We have a lovely speaker, Dr. Kristen Baum, and she's the director of the Monarch Watch, as well as a senior scientist at the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research. And she's also a professor at the Kansas University Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So wow, what an expert. She's done a lot of research with pollinators, especially our monarchs, and the effects of land use and management practices on their conservation and distribution. She's also really cool. She's from Waynesboro, Virginia, so she is from here. She also earned her bachelor's degree from the College of William & Mary and her master's and PhD from Texas A&M University. So wow, what an expert on the field, and we're so excited to have her tonight. So let's, again, reminder, if you have any questions during the webinar at any time, please put them in that Q&A and we'll go over them at the end. So hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Baum.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So I will start with kind of an overview of monarchs. Let's see. Thinking about the eastern migratory population that Jessica mentioned, that will be the right-hand part of the graph. Kind of if you look at the continental divide and the Rocky Mountains, that separates the eastern and the western populations. So the monarchs that we have in the east will start with the winter. So they overwinter in central Mexico, so down at the site indicated by the blue star down there. So they'll overwinter in central Mexico. They'll start moving north in the spring. They will reach Texas. This year it was early March. It can be a little bit later depending on the year. And they'll lay that first generation. So they'll lay eggs in Texas, and then they'll continue to move farther north. So the monarchs that emerge from those first round of eggs will move farther north and reach the upper US all the way to southern Canada. And then in the fall, so starting in August, so in southern Canada, we're seeing lots of monarch migratory activity. And then they'll continue to move south and down through the central U.S. Down to the overwintering sites in central Mexico. So the same individuals that leave those northern latitudes will reach Mexico overwinter and then come back to southern Texas in the spring. So a very unique migratory phenomena. And then if you think about the Western population, so again, that's going to be west of the Rocky Mountains, they are going to overwinter along the coast of California. So very different. And they kind of have a little bit of a different migratory pattern with less distinct generations and movement than what we see in the East. And it's actually interesting if you look at the map kind of for Arizona and New Mexico, that's an interesting part of the country where some of those monarchs are going to go south to Mexico and some of them are going to go west to California. So kind of a unique area of the country. And then if you look over in southern Florida, there's also a year-round resident population. But where we have the biggest concern would be that eastern migratory population, and we've also seen declines for the western population. And I'll talk more about the eastern population in a minute, but I did want to kind of put up this nice circle graph from Journey North that kind of shows the different generations to kind of put that in that context as well. So, again, monarchs will be starting from central Mexico, and then we've got that first generation that's arriving in early March in Texas. And then when those monarchs emerge, and if we think about the whole life cycle from egg to adult, it's about a month, depending on conditions. It can be a little bit longer in the early spring. And then those monarchs will be emerging and moving farther north, and then we'll have a couple more generations before we see that migration. So different individuals, are making that migration each year. So you've probably seen this graph before. So this shows the size of the overwintering population on in the sanctuaries in Mexico. And so you'll notice on the y-axis over here, the population size is represented in hectares. So so it's kind of odd to have it in area type of representation, but I'll explain what that looks like next. But you'll notice we had the lowest overwintering population size was that 13-14, so 2013-14, where it was 0.67 hectares. And that's actually when the petition to list the monarch was originally submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But if you go over to this most recent overwintering season, so 2023 and 2024, that's the second lowest population size on record. So a lot of concern about the size of the population based on these overwintering numbers. And so if we think about monarchs in central Mexico, and you've probably seen pictures of them on the overwintering sites where they're just, kind of layered or shingled in the trees. Here's some examples, but, it's really difficult to get a count of the number of monarchs. And so there's been different estimates that have been made over the years, but the most recent study kind of looked at all those previous estimates and came up with this 21.1 million monarchs per hectare. So that's, kind of how you convert hectares to monarchs. So if we think about there being less than a hectare, less than 20 million monarchs this past year, which sounds like a lot of monarchs, but then they've got to survive the winter, make that journey north again. And so very few individuals. And so thinking about tagging, most of the tag recoveries that we have will be from the local community in Mexico, where they'll go out and search for tags. So typically they're picking up tags they find in the on the ground, so kind of the leaf litter. Or monarch wings from dead monarchs. But we are starting to get more pictures of people sending us of monarchs at the overwintering sites in Mexico. So you can see this was one that we got earlier this year. So it was tagged in Ohio on September 25th, and then photographed in Mexico on January 22nd. So, so starting to see more pictures with good lenses these days. And then we also get recoveries that we call domestic recoveries that occur during the fall migration. So maybe you tag a monarch at your home, and maybe it's spotted, some distance away by someone else. So we have those recoveries as well that tell us something about the migration and the movements of monarchs. So if we go back to this map of the size of the overwintering population, I kind of wanted to put the tagging program in perspective, and then also some of the other activities that Monarch Watch has worked on for many years. So Monarch Watch was started in 1992 by Chip Taylor, the founding director, and that it was primarily started for that tagging aspect. And it's really interesting listening to Chip talk about it. I think they thought they would maybe do it for a year, but there was a lot of interest. So I think back then they were posting ads in the newspaper for people interested in tagging. And so over in our building on the KU campus, we've got notebooks from all those years. So you can look back at the paper data sheets and the comments people sent in, and kind of how the tagging program started. But over 30 years later, there's still lots of interest in tagging. And the education part of Monarch Watch's mission was also started back in 1992 as well. And so lots of interest from teachers and schools was a big focus for tagging early on. And then if we look forward, one of the other programs that Jessica mentioned that we have is the Monarch Way Station program. And that was started in 2005. And if you look at that graph of the overwintering population, that at the time was the lowest population size on record. We've certainly hit bigger lows, but I feel like Chip and Monarch Watch have always kind of been ahead of the game in terms of thinking about what is needed for monarchs. And so that's really when a lot of the on the ground conservation efforts started. By Monarch Watch in terms of thinking about monarch way stations, providing habitat, how do we get more milkweed out there on the landscape to support monarchs. And then the other program that I was going to mention that is somewhat related is that Monarch Watch started distributing milkweed in 2013. If we think back to then, it was a lot harder to find native plants, and in particular milkweed. It's a little challenging to germinate, and it wasn't, other than butterfly weed or Asclepias tuberosa, it wasn't available really commercially. So that was a big effort to work with nurseries to grow milkweed. And some of you that are watching probably send us seed. So we receive lots of donations of milkweed seed that allow us to grow milkweed and distribute that. So I'll mention both of those programs, including our free milkweed programs, once I talk a little bit more about tagging. So if you ordered a tagging kit, you would have gotten, a newsletter. I didn't update this for the 2024 one, but a tagging data sheet and your tags in the mail from us. And if you are still interested in tagging, you can order a tagging kit, and we can get that sent your way. But the biggest question we always get is, when should I start tagging monarchs? And so we focus on the fall generation. So we want you to start tagging once we expect that last generation to be emerging. And so we suggest, based on latitude, when to start tagging. So you can look at Virginia kind of falls, maybe that 37 to 39 degrees north for latitude. So looking kind of starting in late August. So August 24th, 27th, 29th would be when you would start tagging in the Virginia area. And we've got this information on our website where you can go and look and kind of see when would be a good time to tag. And we actually recently added this table of tagging dates also to the shop where you order tags to make it easier to find that information as well. And then the other question we get is, when can we expect to see the most monarch activity? So like if you're hosting a tagging event, things like that. And so you can, again, look at latitude and figure out, what looks like prime monarch activity for your area. So again, if we look at the 37, 39 latitudes, you're looking at late September as being kind of when you would expect to see the most activity. And also, we've got a range of kind of when you would expect to see the most monarchs in your area. And so that would be some ideas for when to plan for activity. And it's always challenging to kind of know when there'll be a good number of monarchs. So one thing that I've look at frequently, as many I think do, is the Journey North website. So if you haven't been to Journey North, they collect community scientist observations, kind of first observations in most cases. So we actually use Journey North a ton in the spring. So you can report your first sighting of a monarch, your first egg, your first milkweed when you see that first leaf emerging. And so this is what it looked like last year, since we don't have a lot of data yet for 2024 based on the timing, but you can see they kind of shift to reporting to the fall starting August 16th. And then you can kind of look at this map and see what people are reporting in your area. And it would be great to get lots of more observations for Virginia, for Journey North as well. And if you look at the dots with the white square in the center, those are where people submitted photos. So you can kind of look and see what people are observing. And then you can also look at roost site observations. So roost would be when you have monarchs that are clustering in trees. And again, this is from 2023 because there's only a few reports up there for 2024 so far. But this is helpful. And a lot of times you think about roost forming where there's not a whole lot of trees, so they're needing to aggregate in certain areas to, stay the night. And so I did insert one sighting from Iowa that was reported on September 2nd, but to give you an idea what a roost would look like along the fall migratory route. So you can see this was the picture that was submitted by that observation a few days ago. So that would be a roost in Iowa. So you can submit your roost. You can also submit peak migration, and which was the previous one. So the peak migration is always a little challenging because you're kind of, you only know it's the peak after the fact, but you can submit at any point in time. So that peak migration is very important as well. And so thinking about the tagging and tagging data, you do get a paper data sheet with your tagging kit, and we do have people that still send us their paper data sheets. You can also go to our website and download a spreadsheet that you can enter your data with, or we have the app that you can download and submit your data that way. So some of it depends on, kind of comfort level if you've got, and you can also submit the app data later, depending on connectivity. Or kind of how many you're doing, right? Might influence what's the most convenient for you. But if you look at the app, you can actually scan your sheet of tags, and it can recognize your codes for you. And so some of the important information that we need with the tagging data is knowing where you're tagging at. So your location, and zip code being important for that as well. Also knowing the day that you're tagging and the tagging code. And then we also ask that you report male, female, and we'll look at that in a minute. And then whether it's a reared or wild caught monarch. So if you happen to be, having some monarchs that you reared at home that you're releasing and tagging, versus wild caught, that information is helpful as well. And then you can also report recoveries on the app. And again, maybe you're out tagging and you see one that maybe you tagged a few days before, or maybe it's a new one that you haven't seen before. It's not your tag code. You can report that information here. We also have the Monarch calendar project that you can report. on the app. And so that would be where you're reporting observations of number of monarchs that you're seeing on a daily basis. So that is available. Other information that's available through the app, you create a profile. There's some tagging instructions, including how to identify males and females, and then a lot of our educational materials. We've got some videos where you can look at, how to catch a monarch, how to remove it from the net, how to tag it, all that process. We have some how-to videos as well to show you that. So thinking about male and female monarchs, and this is the information that we include with the tagging kit, but the males have the pouch on their hind wings, or the black dot. So the scent glands, they don't really serve that function in monarchs, but they are still present for the males. Or females, they have their veins are a little bit thicker on the hind wing. It's a little bit difficult to tell, so most people go with the presence or absence of the pouch on the hind wing. And so this is if the monarch were nectaring and had its wings spread out, you would be able to see the view here. So the dorsal, the back side of the monarch. If you look at the underside, which is what you would see if the wings are folded up over the body, it's a little bit more difficult to tell. But you can kind of see, I always give the example, it's kind of like you were writing with a Sharpie and it bled through the paper to the other side. You can kind of see that pouch coming through, and it's raised up a little bit too, that you can see in this picture. So the one on the top is a male and the one on the bottom is a female. And if we were in a live, in-person session, we would do a quiz. Actually, we could have probably set that up, but it is a trick question, so I'll be honest. So if you look at the ones here, I feel like the males are harder. So these are two more examples of males. So here's another male. You can see that pouch on the hind wing. And then this one is maybe a little bit more obvious. It needs to be caught and tagged, though. It does not have a tag yet. So that would be another male for you to view. And certainly when you've got it in hand, you can look at both sides of the wing. And so thinking about proper placement of the tags, it needs to be placed on the hind wing on that center cell, which is called the discal cell if you are an entomologist who studies insects, or we also refer to it as the mitten-shaped cell. So it's kind of got the shape of a mitten with the thumb over here. So as much as you can get it centered on that discal cell is ideal. But once you get it on there, you need to leave it. So, even if it's off a little bit, I mean, you might have noticed the one from the overwintering site was a little bit off, but just leave it. Once it's stuck, you need to just leave it where it is and call it good, even if it's not perfect. So, so that would be proper placement of the tag. And then we had an experiment going with kind of longevity of tags and monarchs. And so I just put in a few pictures, and we just finished on Monday. So I don't have everything compiled yet, but just you can kind of see. And I will say, if you're doing a lot of tagging, one thing that we've always done for my research lab is we always tag the same side of the wing. So that way you can see, here we've got, kind of half of our monarchs are tagged in the cage and half aren't tagged. And so I always put them on the right side. So if you're out catching the next day, you can kind of more easily see if it's one maybe you already tagged. And then thinking about the longevity and how well do the tags stay adhered. You can see this one, the monarch's lost almost all of its scales. It's, kind of nearing the end of its lifespan there, but you can actually, the tag's still on there, and you can almost read the tag, or you can actually read the tag through the backside of the wing. And then I just liked the one of the monarch in the rain. So their scales shed water. So that's, kind of always interesting for monarchs. You can see the water droplets on that one. So thinking about some of the things we've learned from tagging, and this is represented a little bit differently. So, when we think about when to start tagging and what does the peak migration look like, we always talk about latitude. But we shift to longitude when we think about, where are monarchs coming from, and, what does it look like in terms of tag recovery. So you kind of have to shift and look north-south instead of east-west now. So that's kind of what the shaded areas are meant to represent, is kind of longitudes going north-south, and what that looks like. So I put on here, and this is, we've got a new analysis going on with the more recent data. That's a work in progress. It's a very large data set, and so we're working on geocoding and lots of other things with that. But you can, I've got the percent tag, so kind of all the tagged monarchs that we have, where is the most tagging activity going on? And so the most of it's in this darker green area, so 40.9%. And then if you look over here, kind of in the more eastern longitudes, we've got 32.9%. So a good bit of activity in that region as well. We see we've got 25.1% here in the middle, and then not a whole lot once you kind of hit, but you're getting close to that divide with the Western population. And then we've got percent recovered, from the overwintering sites. And so we've got a lot of recovery in that center of the dark green area, and less in other regions of the country. I will say the importance of different regions varies depending on the year. So depending on conditions. Sometimes the eastern, coast can be much more important depending on what conditions were like for monarchs. So kind of looking at it by year basis kind of gives you a different perspective on what that looks like. And so this year it was interesting. We've had the second lowest population size on record on the overwintering sites. And then reports coming out of Texas were actually pretty good this spring. There was actually a lot of activity seen. And so, it looked pretty promising, but then conditions have not been that great in the upper Midwest region. So it's one where, production in the East might be important, depending on what it looked like for different regions. So we'll know more as the migration becomes more, active, and we start to see more reports throughout the U.S. Will be helpful. So kind of going back to this map of the overwintering numbers, I wanted to mention I'm going to kind of shift, and I'll talk about monarch way stations, also our milkweed distribution and our free milkweed programs. And then I will come back, and I have a few monarchs. If anybody would like to see some live tagging, I can do a brief demo on Zoom. And so if you want to get a feel for what that's like. So thinking about monarchs and habitat. So when we think about the decline, there's lots of reasons for the decline. One of the biggest being habitat loss and loss of milkweed. So if we look at the map on the left of the screen, that shows protected areas. And so you can see for the eastern migratory population, not much of that's colored in. So we don't have a lot of, public protected land to have for conservation efforts for monarchs. So that means it really depends on, private, landowners, property owners, what you can do. So more thinking about the public and what's possible is more important for the East. And then the map on the right is the cropland data layer that the National Agricultural Statistics Service compiles each year. And that kind of highlights some of the challenges. So if you look at the north central part of the state, so the Midwest, you can see that kind of golden color, that's corn. The dark green is soybeans. And so lots of corn and soybean production where we had a lot of loss of milkweed from crop fields, as we had Roundup Ready corn and soybeans. And so a lot of loss of milkweed from that area, which is, also where there's lots of monarch production. And so then, as you move farther east, there's different challenges with urbanization and other types of issues. So, but thinking about, the importance for the eastern migratory population being a lot focused on, what can people do, whether it's, small scale, large scale, anything to create more habitat for for monarchs. The Monarch Way Station program was started in 2005. And this map is current up through the end of July of this year. And so we've got over 48,000 Monarch Way stations that have been registered. We actually have Monarch Way stations in 12 countries or territories worldwide, including a few that do not have monarchs. So that's always interesting. But the concept and the idea has been so important to people that we've had registrations from even countries that don't have monarchs. And so I pulled up our top 10 states for number of way stations. And I did not correct for area, but we can see Virginia is there as number 9. So quite good. And then I kind of lumped everybody else as less than 1,500. Certainly at 2061, you could easily overtake some of those nearby states for a number of way stations. And we're hoping to hit the 50,000 mark this year. For way station registrations. What is a way station? What needs to be in it? So any size works for habitat for monarchs. If you've got the space, an ideal size would be 100 square feet or more. Most of our good pollinator plants and most milkweeds require sun. Partial shade can work depending on what you've got available. Good drainage, having relatively dense plants but not crowded. So if you think about kind of your perfectly manicured garden with ornamental plants, they tend to be very widely spaced out. So trying to get something a little bit more denser than that. Milkweed plants needing 10 or more plants, ideally 2 or more species. We recommend the 2 or more just because, maybe one year one of your species doesn't do as well as the other. And then 10 or more for anybody that's had monarchs or ever reared any at home. You know how much they eat especially once they reach that 5th instar stage. So wanting to make sure you've got plenty of plants to support monarchs. And then milkweeds are also really important nectar plants. So they're a great nectar resource for monarchs as well as other butterflies and bees. As well. And then making sure you've got other nectar plants available, and there's lots of flexibility in what those might be, but you want to make sure that that you've got blooming plants that are going to occur throughout the entire growing season. And making sure that you've got plants that hit that fall migration period. And it's interesting when you think about the fall migration period, what's important varies depending on the year. So one good example would be, we used to have this field of sunflowers we would go out to and collect a lot of monarchs from. One year we got a whole bunch. We went out the next year, the migration was a little bit later. All of the sunflowers were past flowering. So, there were no resources there. So, it kind of varies depending on the year. And so wanting to make sure you've got plants that are going to bloom throughout that entire fall migratory season, as well as during the reproductive season, is important. So making sure you've got resources available. And again, some years, maybe you've got a late bloomer, blooming plant that's not going to be important or not used, but you hit that one year where there's not much else available. They can be very important. And then also thinking, all the different extremes, right? So we've got drought, we've got flooding, it seems like you kind of want plants that are going to do well with all the extremes as well, because those will be times that it's challenging for monarchs to find resources. And we do think this past fall, I didn't put in the drought monitor maps, but that was one of the thoughts for the low population size, because the migration itself seemed okay, but we had a drought that extended from southern Oklahoma all the way down through Texas and through Mexico all the way to the overwintering site. So there really wasn't any place for monarchs to make up that difference in nectar. So they might be able to recover if it were a narrower range. And then in terms of management, don't use insecticides since you want to be supporting insects. And then depending on the setting, you might want to mulch or thin or water, not necessarily necessary depending on what you have, but acknowledging that it may be important in some settings. and then adding other features to support education and other pollinators or wildlife. Some good examples, a lot of our good nectar plants for monarchs are also have the thick, pithy plant stems that are good for stem nesting bees. And so you could think about, when you cut those dead stems back, leaving them a whole nother cycle so that bees could potentially use those as nest sites. Or even thinking about lots of good overlap with birds and seeds and other things. So lots of ways, depending on what you're interested in, to support monarchs and other pollinators or wildlife. And then this is a picture from Monarch Way Station number 1. So that was the first Monarch Way Station, which is located adjacent to our building on campus. And it's huge, so you can just get some small snapshot. And so this was a recent one, but you can see we've got some common milkweed over here to the side, and then lots of different flowering plants. And the nice thing about Monarch Way Station number 1 is that the Douglas County Master Gardeners, they come, once a week. Thursdays, they have a whole team of people. And so it's really their effort and lots of work and investment that goes into maintaining it. It makes me realize why my garden at home might need a little bit of work. But so beautiful and lots of options. And we have, for example, people that stop by to see what's blooming at different times to see what they might want to add to their garden. But that's also got the link to where you can register. And if you're interested in getting a Monarch Way Station sign, we have those available on our website as well. So thinking about free milkweed, we do have 2 different programs that the applications will be opening up. And we could let you know, Jessica, when they're open if you wanted to send it out. But we have 2 different free milkweed programs, a Free Milkweeds for Restorations project, and then also a Free Milkweeds for schools and nonprofits. And so they've got different requirements, restoration being kind of not that garden or home setting, but a bigger property, so 2 acres or more. Making sure you've got nectar plants to go along with the milkweeds that would be provided. And then we have the free milkweeds for schools and nonprofits as well. And we do those based on ecoregions. So again, we have volunteers that send us seed. And I was looking at, so if you look at Virginia, there's going to be 3 ecoregions depending on where you're at. So 221, 231, and 232. I know we had common milkweed available for all 3 of those. I think we might have had swamp and butterfly weed for 221, and maybe butterfly weed in Syriga for 231. So it depends on what we get sent. So we could potentially have more available as well. But we have had quite a few participants from Virginia in those programs as well. And then if you're interested in collecting seed, this is actually some of our Monarch Watch team members, Casey, Ann, and Dina, out collecting milkweed seed pods. We've got some that we tend to not get for our local area, so we go collect the seeds ourselves. And this is green antelope horn milkweed, but you can see the seed pod, as it's starting to split open, so the seeds are good. You can collect seed, or maybe you've got other people to distribute seed to, but that's a example. And then here's a picture from one of our nurseries growing out a lot of milkweed. And then the picture on the right is some of those flats of milkweed that were shipped out to different sites. So if you're interested, that would be available as well. And then I was going to shift back to tagging. And then I just had put in the video. That was from 2022. And at the time I was at Oklahoma State University. And you have to look closely, but it was one of those students were stopping to take pictures of all the monarchs. They were so noticeable, and you could kind of go, I'd set my timer for 15 minutes because I would end up with tons of monarchs to process. And so you could kind of gently flop your net and get several at a time. So it's always nice if you have a really good location. And those are ornamental abelia bushes that they have on campus, but the monarchs love those. And then just some of the other things we've looked at for monarchs, wing size can vary a lot and be representative of, milkweed availability that they had as caterpillars, also temperature and things like that. So we'll measure wing length, also weight, so you can see one of those monarchs has a very big abdomen, so it's fueled up. The other one less so, so kind of getting an idea of that. And then just a example of kind of the glassing envelope. So if you've got a bigger project where you're going to collect a few, take them back to a table and process them, that is possible as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and then hopefully go to a bigger view so we can look at a few monarchs. And we do have some examples on our website. So, kind of, if you've got a net, to make sure to, flip and, kind of how to catch. I guess I won't try that in the office. I could actually toss one in the net, but I may hit something as well. So I've got a few monarchs here, and actually your tags come in a large glassine envelope. So the glassine envelopes are kind of like wax paper envelopes. And then maybe I think they might use them for cookies and other things, depending on or coin envelopes too, I think. But they protect the monarch so they don't beat up their wings. So you can put them in there for a little bit. So that's what I have mine in. And so what I do with my tags, is you'll get a sheet of tags, and you can see I've used some. But so, it's a little challenging to figure out how to get the tags off without sticking them to yourself, or something else. And so I kind of like to, and everybody's got a different method, but I'll get them kind of ready where I've got a little edge of the sticker that you can see. And then in the field, if you're outside, of course, you've got to then bend it back when you're done tagging your monarch if you're doing one at a time, right? But if you're sitting at a table, kind of that is a good way to speed it up as well. And I will, so when you get your monarch out of a net, or if you've got it at home, you'll want to kind of bend its wings back, and there's lots of different ways you can hold them. Yeah, this little guy. Actually, this is a female. I don't know that I can get it close enough where everybody could identify whether it's a male or a female. But there's lots of different ways you can hold them, and they're pretty sturdy. They do like to play dead sometimes. This one is kind of, alternates between kicking and then, so don't fall for it and let them go. But you can figure out how you like to hold your monarch. And again, I always like to tag the right side just because it's a habit, and I've always done it that way. But this is the cell in the center of the hind wing, the mitten shaped cell that you're going to want to put your tag on. And so I'll get my sheet of tags, and if you've got, somebody helping, it can work pretty well, but then you try to just get the tip off, if you've got a little bit of a fingernail, it helps. And then you just place it on there, and then you just hold it for a couple seconds to make sure that it adheres well. And I will say, Chip would always talk about how the adhesive goes to the scales and adheres to the membrane. I thought it sounded maybe a little too good, but my example of the ones in the cage where they've lost all their scales, it is very true. So they do adhere very well, but do make sure to hold it to make sure you got it on there good, and there would be your tagged monarch. So, and then you could send them on their way. And monarchs are pretty sturdy. You have some people that are worried about touching wings, that there are other butterflies and moths that lose a lot of scales, right? But monarchs don't. So you can do that. And then, some of the things I was going to say, this one's kicking that we do with kids, it's always kind of fun. They've got the little kind of sticky feet, right? So they always like to, you can kind of, have them put their finger out and have the monarch stick. They're very, very grippy feet. So with that, I guess I would be happy to take some questions.
Amazing. So thank you to the willing participant, I guess kind of willing participant butterfly, but yeah, that's Wonderful. Right on time. Okay, so just as a reminder for folks, if you can, please do submit your questions to the Q&A section, not the chat. So we're going to go through those questions on the Q&A section. Okay. And then I'm sorry, Kylie, if this is a little bit confusing, but I'm going to do Michael Cantwell's question first because it's related to a question that I have for you. So, Michael asks, I see milkweed along a couple of trails in Virginia, and have you ever considered partnering with other organizations like Rails to Trails to add more milkweed along trails? And kind of my question that goes along with that, people have discussed adding pollinator plants alongside roads. But that's kind of concerning because then we have insects flying into cars. So I think it's a two-part question. Benefits of adding pollinator like milkweed to trails or roads and partnering with other organizations, or do you know of organizations that do that?
Yes. So, and I will say that is the one amazing thing about Monarchs. And since if you go back to, look at all the different organizations that exist since the original petition was submitted in 2014, there's an amazing number of groups that have formed. And so, for example, thinking about different types of rights of way, there's a rights of way as habitat working group. And I think the key for roadsides is identifying what would be good locations for habitat, right? So, and of course, one always has to maintain the safety zone, and think about, what makes sense from the motorist perspective as well. But there are quite a few efforts, and I think the Virginia DOT is involved in some of those to provide habitat. And again, I think it's you can think about prioritizing areas, and there have been some studies on mortality on roadsides, which have kind of varied depending on what that looks like. But I think where it gets to be the most challenging is, which isn't really related to habitat on roadsides at all, but is when you get down to Texas and it's getting, the monarchs are kind of condensing and coming together, and you've got more and more migrants. There'll be hot spots of road kills, but it's more based on winds and temperature and conditions that influence, where those end up. But that is a challenge, during the migration, and there's so many factors that come into play that influence where those are, but there are some locations that tend to be kind of consistent where there will be, I mean, not every year, but some years where there might be higher mortality. But there are lots of groups looking at getting more habitat out there. I think when you've got areas that have habitat, a lot of times you can manage in a way that will increase habitat availability. And we have had different organizations that have reached out for some of the restoration milkweeds or other types of things. So we have worked with different groups over the years to provide habitat. There's other resources. There's a Farmers for Monarchs group that thinks about the context of meeting producer needs as well as providing monarch habitat. So how do you balance all of that? So I think there's lots of thoughtful conversations that are going on, thinking about addressing those multiple needs, because that's really where we're at, right? With I think with getting enough habitat out there is recognizing that there's multiple needs that need to be addressed with most of our different land use types. But did I hit everything? Hopefully, maybe.
I think so. Yeah, I think there are just so many really wonderful organizations out there that do it. I know in Loudoun County, the Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy is doing stuff with monarch butterflies and providing more habitat. So I would definitely recommend to anybody here, look up your local sort of organizations and then get involved, of course, with Wild Virginia, because if you Dr. Baum listed that map and showed that we don't really have that many conserved lands on the East Coast. So here at Wild Virginia, that's our mission, to create more of those conserved lands. So if you want largers to be involved in larger scale conservation, come to us. But there's definitely efforts all over the state with organizations doing things by adding milkweed to trails and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, super fascinating about the roads. That's great. Okay. So let's go. We have quite a bit of questions. Let's go through some of these other questions. A little bit more about tagging. So can we use tags that are left over from previous years, say 2022?
So the adhesive will degrade over time. So what we usually recommend is you could, like if you have tags left from last year, you could use them this year, but you probably don't want to go beyond that because if you go to the effort of tagging, you probably want to, just to make sure that there's not any issues. But we are pretty confident that the previous years would be fine. But less confident when you get farther back in time. And I guess I should add, as long as they've been kept in a temperature controlled, in their envelope and haven't been exposed to moisture or other types of things. So make sure to keep them well protected.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Any kind of examples of false monarchs? I think they're talking about like mimics of monarchs and to avoid the wrong identification of sort of false.
Oh, yes. So viceroys would be the probably most confused one. I mean, there are occasionally other ones, but once you have them in hand, I think. But the viceroys have the solid line. I would not have any pictures handy, but they have a line that goes across their entire. We could send a link or something, but they would be probably the most likely to be confused with monarchs. Of course, depending on where you are, there's always there's others like queens and that will end up being somewhat similar. That's actually a good question about the most confused, but yeah. So and we haven't really had any issues per se. But also, probably because the migration is focused on a particular time period, which might help as well. But there's definitely some that can be a little confusing when you're new to monarchs.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we can in the follow-up email, we can provide some links for that type of identification as well as everything from Monarch Watch. A great question. Okay, next one. Your thoughts on how they find their way back to the mountains in Mexico during their migration.
Yes, because that is amazing. It's multiple generations removed. Um, and there's no definitive answer yet, but there's lots of, even thinking about the whole migratory route and but there's in terms of different environmental cues and their magnetic compass and all those pieces. But I feel like there's still more work to be done to figure out how they actually end up at those sanctuaries. And there are and I think it was interesting this year, if you look at the actual report of the sanctuaries in Mexico, there'll be ones that aren't the kind of well-known long-term sanctuaries. So they're the monarchs are kind of in different locations sometimes, and some of the ones that were open to the public were low. That had traditionally been good were low this year, but there were some other locations that were good. So even they're kind of not always in the same locations. But
All right. And kind of back to sort of like tagging and questions about tagging. Does the oil from your fingers not damage the wings?
no, and I guess it's pretty short term. When we do kind of wash, if we're doing a lot. And of course, I have the advantage of taking them back to the lab, right? But we don't have concerns about that particular aspect. Doesn't seem to be a challenge, but.
Great. And then sort of another tagging, you were holding and pinching the butterfly on its body or on the wings where the wings join the body. So I guess they're kind of asking where you're holding.
Okay, I'll get it out again because I don't know if I so yeah, and when you pull, yeah, so I guess, and you can figure out where, so I guess I'm holding it at the base of the wings, kind of, but then when you put the tag on, maybe you shift a little bit more to where the thorax, so where the wings attach to the body. She's very kicking those feet at the moment, but yeah, it does take a little bit to get used to holding them. Yeah, but I guess you have to be able to, I guess the challenge is you have to be able to have access to the discal cell, which means you kind of have to hold them down lower. So, but
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think it definitely takes like a little bit of practice, but I think once you do like one or two, you kind of get the hang for like what's too tight, what's not too tight, what's the kind of perfect balance. So yeah, it just takes those first couple. But that's we're gonna send all the information also from Monarch Watch, which gives all the detailed instructions and everything. But great question. Let's see here. Let's see, one from Lily. Is there a good way to encourage fresh growth of milkweed in the fall? Most of mine is old and tough by the fall.
So there, and I have done some research on mowing as well as prescribed fire and then milkweed regrowth, right? And there's been some other studies. I don't know if they hit Virginia in particular, but it will regrow. The timing, I guess, is always a little bit challenging. And you may have existing monarch activity, right? So you kind of have to find that balance between getting tender regrowth and having support. But so maybe if you've got an area, maybe you mow half of it, not the whole thing. So that way you've got some fresh as well. But they do prefer, kind of the more tender regrowth. And I would say for this area, and uh, yeah, and of course I was in Oklahoma for many years before this. So, Oklahoma used to always say kind of early July was good timing for mowing, but we also didn't have much monarch activity at all during the summer months, right? So it was much easier there. But yeah, if you can generate some tender regrowth, and if you haven't had monarch activity in your area, that would certainly be a good option.
All right, awesome. So we might I have to hold off of some of these questions, but I'm going to try to go through these questions with some really important ones. So one that was kind of related to catching, how do you catch them without sort of harming them? Are there any tips on that?
Yeah, and we have some videos, and I had my net here, but I didn't think I would be able to. Anyway, I was trying to think I'd have to go back in the back, but I definitely, we definitely swinging and flipping so that the net flips over. Yeah, there's probably not. And make sure you have a nice soft net, that's not, but you have to flip it. So then the monarchs typically, down in this part, and they will sometimes be in the edge. So if you're like sure you caught it, but you don't see it in the, top of your net, make sure to look along the edge. But they're pretty sturdy. I don't, you would rarely damage one. The other option, if you have like a plant, you don't want to, one problem with the flip method is sometimes you'll get the flower as well. But you can also do the flop method, but you have to kind of hold it up and try to get them to go up as quickly as possible because they'll try to sneak out, around the bottom. But yeah, I think they're sturdier than you think, and yeah. So I think if you've got a decent net, it should hopefully be okay. So. And you can kind of, for monarchs, you can kind of sneak up on them, right? So you don't necessarily have to go fast until the end, right? And
Yeah.
if they're nectaring, sometimes, yeah, they'll be very absorbed and not be paying attention at all to what's happening behind them. I've actually, and I don't recommend this, but occasionally if they're really hungry, you can, actually just pluck them quickly off the flowers. So.
Very good. That works.
So,
Okay, unfortunately, we only have time for like one more question. We're gonna have to let our speaker go, but again, we will give information in our follow-up email about probably more questions that you have on all the instructions and everything you need from Monarch Watch. But let's do one more. Let's see here. Um, do 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 do. Any flight behavior research involving flight mills or harmonic radar? It's interesting. Do you know anything about that?
there has been a little bit, and I actually, anyway, I had tried to get a flight mill, but anyway, I didn't want to build it myself, but so I'd sent in a request to the physics shop, but that did not work for me. But there have been some looking at direction, directionality related to different, cues and the fall migration. So there's been some of that, and there are better and better tags being developed. So, there's the blue morpho tag that's solar powered, but it's still a very relatively large percent of a monarch's body weight. So if we think about the Monarch Watch tags, they're like 1 to 2% of the body weight versus 12 to 15. So it does get to be challenging, but those tags, and you also have to have MODIS stations available, and people out there with cell phones tracking them, but maybe that can answer some really interesting questions during the breeding season. But it would, definitely maybe be a challenge at this point for that fall migration flight. But we'll get there one of these days. So.
Yeah, technology is always getting better and better. It's really
Yeah.
quite amazing. They're making leaps and bounds in terms of that. Okay, so unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. We have to let our speaker go, but please do join me in saying thank you in the chat to our speaker. This was really wonderful. Again, in a follow-up email, we'll give all the type of information from Monarch Watch on everything you need for tagging, for making a way station, maybe even getting some of those milkweed plants. And yes, so we will send out all that information in a follow-up email, but thank you so much for being here. We really enjoyed this. This is incredible. Yeah, and keep doing all your wonderful work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, anyone. So again, we'll follow up with an email. Thank you.